Hello, and thank you for joining us here in person and all of you who are online. My name is Monica Galvan, and tonight I am here with Jenna Inzetta. She's going to be sharing with us her experience here at the Castle House. For those of you who haven't been here, perhaps, I'd like to give you a little introduction to the James Castle House. The James Castle House celebrates the life and the work of American artist James Castle. It does it through exhibitions, community programs, research, residency programs, and conservation of the historic spaces where Castle lived and worked for over 4 decades. The James Castle House is a program of the Boise City Department of Arts and History, which offers many other services, including public art, history programs, archives, cultural grants, and care and conservation. And I want to thank the City of Boise for its ongoing support and for remaining committed to our work at the Arts and History Department. Before I move on to having Jenna share tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the broader history of the land of the James Castle sits on today. We recognize the ancestral, cultural, traditional, and unceded territories of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Northern Paiute people whose land the site sits on today. The room where we're sitting in today displays our current exhibition, and I'm going to welcome you to take a look after the presentation for those of you in the room, and then we're also going to get to see Jenna's beautiful artwork once we open the doors. But if you are at home and perhaps in New York and would ever want to come check out the James Castle House, please come make a plan. This exhibition here is going to be up until February 1st, 2025. And now on to the main event. I said New York because Jenna is from New York. We're excited to share Jenna's work, like I said before, and just hear about what she's been doing behind these closed doors. And she's going to answer some questions after the presentation. We'll have a question and answer period. So please feel free to write your thoughts and your questions in the chat box if you're online. And of course, here we'll just share our questions with each other. Jenna resides in Brooklyn, New York. She is primarily working in collage. She is from New Jersey. Her work focuses on the dissection of reconstruction and memories and experiences through the utilization of scraps, found objects, salvaged materials, and children's workbook supplies like crayons, scotch tape, and scissors. The final collages serve as chronicles to document moments in her life and past. During her time here in residency, which has been great, Jenna has been talking and going to the Castle's archives. She's been listening to some of the family interviews provided by the BSU archives. She's been making connections with other residents, both at Searles Place and Commonwealth. Jenna's first experience learning about Castle was from her professor, and she instantly felt a connection to his work. And I think having her in this space has just been really unique and a great experience overall. And I'm going to turn it over to her so she can share a little bit more about these past 10 weeks here and share about her work. Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you. Okay, I guess I'll get into it. And thank you to everybody at the James Castle House for having me, and for all of you for coming. It really means a lot. And shout out to my dad at home for shipping me 10 pounds of crayons back in August that wouldn't fit in my suitcase. It was definitely overkill. This morning I shipped 9.9 pounds back, but it definitely felt necessary in the beginning. So I'm gonna flip through some pictures of things I was making during undergrad to kind of show the things I was thinking about then and how it all snowballed into the type of work that I'm making now. Here are a few collages that I made for assignments I really hated collage like so much back then, so it's very funny to look back now and think about that. I couldn't imagine making any other type of work now. I think part of the problem back then was that I was only really able to see these as a means to an end and not as the finished product. So I would make these collages and then I would make paintings from the collages. And as I go through the next few slides, you'll see that became a recurring theme for a couple of years because for the most part, I was very committed to painting and to being a painter at this time. So here's an example of a painting of the collage, which is so funny because to me, this is just a bad painting. There's like an air in the collages that I just never, ever would have been able to achieve through paint. These were the types of paintings that I was making. I was focused a lot on interior spaces and spaces that I considered home. Around this time, my grandpa had dementia pretty bad, which was hard to kind of watch him lose himself and forget everything over the course of my life. And it was scary, and it kind of lit this fire under me to really desperately hold on to everything that I cared about the most. And so I was thinking about this theme of memory in the paintings, and I was using this idea of fleeting light as a metaphor for fleeting memory. So during sunrise or sunset, when you got that very brief window of time where the light is stretching and growing, and I would try to capture just one single moment of that. So this is my parents' house, and this is my first apartment in New York, as is this and this. And then this is a big turning point for me. These were the first collages that I made of my own volition, and not because I was told to, but because I wanted to. But there is a little bit of a story on how I landed on making these. I was still in college. Okay, so just as a reference point, I graduated 2021, which meant that I spent the second half of my college career over Zoom instead of in a classroom, which obviously was not ideal, but we did our best. And so it was the end of 2020 and I hadn't seen my family in a long time, and I really just wanted to go home for Christmas. And so I went and got my COVID test, and then I went home and quarantined, and I got my results back negative. So my dad drove into the city to take me back to New Jersey, and we had a wonderful Christmas. And then 2 days later, somehow I got COVID. And I was stuck in New Jersey for many weeks waiting for my negative results to come back because I didn't want to go get my roommate sick. And eventually classes started up again, which was fine because it was remote, so I could tune in to class from New Jersey. The only issue was that all of my art supplies were still back home and I had assignments to complete. So I kind of had to work with what I had left over from when I was a kid. I had, pens and pencils from the junk drawer, but I also found, those like twist up crayons. So I was playing around with those, and I made these as just sort of quick generative things. I think part of the reason I was able to play around with these so much is because I didn't put any weight on making them. In making them, in my head, I probably thought I was gonna throw them away. But now looking back, they, to me, are the first kind of domino that was pushed and then eventually led to everything you'll see in the next couple of slides. And they were also the beginning of a really long battle between myself and my weird, stubborn commitment to painting and the really obvious fact that I should just put the paintbrush down and focus on making collages. So here's some more examples of just paintings that I was making of collages. I returned to that once again. I started off by making these little things, and then the first thing I did after making these was I made this painting of the top right collage, and then I made this, to me, pretty boring painting of this kind of cool collage. And eventually, through a lot of trial and even more error, I decided it was time to just quit this tug of war that I was dealing with and focus on one thing and one thing only, and seeing how far I could get if I just focused on the collages. So the first few things I made after making that decision were little interiors of my room, and I had already been really interested in interior spaces, so it's not surprising to me that I was just thinking about the same things in a different material. Here's that same window just during the day. And this is the last painting I made, I think, before I decided to give up on it for a while. It was kind of my last ditch effort to, well, maybe if I don't paint the collage directly, but I just make a painting that feels like this, I could get away with it. And it just wasn't working, and so I gave up. And so I started making these little objects and small collages just to learn the material and its behavior and get a feel for it. And I'm still thinking about light and home and memory. And it's interesting to see how those themes have warped since the material shift. I had been really dependent on this idea of using fleeting light and temporary light and shadow moments as a sort of visual representation of my concerns. But now I think, even though I will still do that, I think the material does it itself, because I don't know how the crayons will hold up over time. Construction paper fades pretty significantly over years, and I don't know how long Elmer's glue will hold up. And so sometimes I think about investing in better quality materials whose longevity I can be more confident in, but a part of me does like the idea of these things possibly slowly falling apart through time, just as the specific details of a memory or experiment or experience will slowly but surely fade away as you age. So this one was pretty big. I want to say it's 40 by 50, and it's the first large collage that I made. It's of my room. You can see over on the right that I was focused on these big patches of sun that were coming in during the early morning. And so I'm scaling up, I'm messing around with this material. I'm thinking a lot about memory and home. And around this time, a couple of my teachers said, hey, you should probably check out James Castle. I think there's something in that work for you. And boy, were they right. I looked him up and I looked at his work, and he really quickly became my favorite artist. And I'm sure everybody who comes here and does this residency says this, but I really do feel such a strong connection to James Castle and his work. And from the very first moment I saw his drawings, especially of interior spaces, I felt like I had been there before. So to be able to come here and live here and spend time in his shed and in his trailer and have these weird feelings of misplaced nostalgia realized, that has been a very special thing for me and for the work. This is my parents' living room. I've made so many collages of their house, and I think I will probably make hundreds before I stopped making work. This was my old apartment building lobby, and this was the outside of that building. I think at this point, this was the largest one I had made. It's 60 inches tall by 40 inches wide. And this is another small little study. I really liked the texture of the bricks. That was something I was, and still am, a little bit obsessed with. So then at this point I graduated and I didn't make anything for months and months. And a friend happened to be going out of town and said, hey, you should really use my studio while I'm gone. And so I had set aside like 2.5, 3 days to just put my head down and make something. And I had been thinking a lot about James Castle when I made this one. I was thinking about his soot drawings on cardboard and that dreamy quality that the brown paper helped him to achieve. And so I was trying to see if I could get that same thing in my work if I used this brown butcher paper instead of just white printer paper that I had been using in the past. And this is, I think, the first time that I used anything besides a white base color. And so that was a little turning point for me that ended up being pretty important later down the line. And then many, many more months passed and I didn't make anything. And then my grandpa passed away, which was obviously hard. And I think because I had been thinking about him so much in my work, the only way I really knew how to deal with that loss was by making more work about him. And so I made a few collages of these grapevines. He was a really avid gardener. He had a magnificent garden in the backyard, and a huge part of my memory of him is standing underneath his grapevines and eating myself sick. Yeah. And so I made these. I didn't really think about it, I just made them. Looking back, they're also important because this was the first time I was making images of organic forms. Everything before this, if we go back, had been based off of something man-made. And so with every piece made, they felt like they were getting more kind of rigid and uptight. And so just switching my subject matter helped me kind of loosen up a bit. And then I made a handful of pieces like this of just kind of starting to combine those two things of the bricks and the chain link fence, as well as these organic forms kind of laced through them. And all of that eventually led to this big piece. It's taller than me. I think it's maybe 78 or 74 inches tall. And it took me a really long time to make. And then this one I was using white paper, brown paper, and black paper, which was really helping me achieve a broader range of value and just explore these images that I was interested in a bit further. This piece in particular is about my family, and most of my work is, but we have spent a lot of time in the Finger Lakes together and have a lot of really beautiful memories of spending time up there. And this is in a national park in Penyan, I think. And it's such a beautiful sight to behold. And although this is representative of all of our time up there, it's also referencing this one trip in particular, which was kind of bittersweet because yes, we had a great time and we saw beautiful things and we laughed and what have you, but it was also kind of on the heels of losing another loved one. So that was in the back of our mind the whole time we were there, and it was in the back of my mind the whole time I made this. And even though I had been starting to mess around with more organic subject matter, I was still very very interested and dedicated to exploring interior spaces and homes. So this is once again my parents' living room. The green couch that was in that other one is this little green strip at the bottom. So it's almost like you're sitting on that couch looking behind you. And then this isn't like super important ideas wise, it's just of my friend's band. But thinking about it now, it was kind of important because it's the first time I was putting figures in collages. And even more importantly, this was the first time I used colored construction paper as a base, which really, really opened up just what I could do palette wise and felt like I was on track for something new. And then I came here and I kept going back and forth on how I should present these images, if I should organize them by theme or chronologically. And I decided to go in vaguely in the order that I made them. So this is the first thing that I made. And it seemed, so this is of a dresser thing that's in James Castle's shed, which is outside. And if you haven't had the chance to go in, definitely go in there. It's incredible. But it seemed kind of like a no-brainer that this would be the first thing that I make. And my favorite part of making art is, and it doesn't happen that often, but when you sit down and you start working on something, and then you kind of go into a trance, and then all of a sudden you come out of it hours later and there's this finished thing in front of you. And so that happened with this one, which just makes it feel even more special to me. And one of my bigger goals and areas of focus coming into this residency was to improve on my color. I used to just use whatever, whenever, as I was working. And honestly, it wasn't considered or intentional at all. And so you can kind of tell the difference, I think, between one of the more recent pieces I made before coming here and even the first thing I made while coming here. Now I really take the time to sit down and focus on making a super intentional and considered and unified color palette even before I start making the picture. So sometimes I'll spend a few hours coloring, sometimes I'll spend a whole day or two coloring, depending on the size of the work and I guess the spectrum of color I'm interested in getting to. And I didn't mention before, but my process is I use crayons and I color on sheets of paper and then I tear them up and glue them together and make these pictures. So the second thing that I finished while being here is this little study, well, not little, it's kind of large, of hydrangeas. And I had, like, day one, I knew this was the place for me because I walk in and Monica was like, oh, normally we put out fresh flowers for the new residents, but these ones just dried so nicely that I thought I would keep them for you. And I'm standing there screaming in my head like, oh, this is perfect because I love dead flowers. And I have them all, I have them all over my apartment back home. So that was my first little sign of like, oh, this is such a special place and I am meant to be here. I think it's really cool how dead flowers kind of mummify themselves as they dry, and at least in this case, their death preserves life. And I'm thinking about that kind of idea a lot while I'm making the work, that by building these images, I can preserve my experience of them and of making them. This is my dog. I just missed her and I didn't know what to make. And so I thought, I'll just make a quick little thing of her to keep my hands busy. And then I made this one of the house because I couldn't come here and not make a collage of the James Castle house. I started to mess with texture in this one in a way that I hadn't before, to get that stucco of the outside. So I layered some sheets of paper on top of each other, and then while they were still soaked with glue, I took an X-Acto knife and scratched around until I got the surface that I wanted. And this is a study of the house at night. I love when I come home after the sun has set. The way this light here on the porch floods into the driveway is really beautiful. And I'm still making some flowers. This was more just a color study. I had made this palette, I think the first day that I came here, and I had it sitting in a pile in the corner of the studio, and I didn't know what to do with it. And I thought, oh yes, some more flowers on fence. And then these marigolds were interesting to make because they were alive when I started making them, and they were in water. And over the course of working on this piece, I would come back to it and they would have moved a lot. And I was thinking, like, what is going on? I certainly didn't move them, and there's nobody else in here, so what gives? And I realized, oh, they're wilting. And so it became this like race against time to capture this temporary moment once again before they drooped down completely. And I think it was important that this happened kind of early on because it really solidified just this idea of I'm trying to capture these snapshots of things that can be really, really easily forgotten. A lot of my work is not that exciting. A lot of it is just an empty space or just a very brief moment in time. And to me, even those are special, and I just want to hang on to everything. So in some ways, sitting down and building these images and memories up physically with layers of paper also helps to build and rebuild them mentally in my mind so that I can remember them. And here is interior. I'm thinking a lot about light in this one. This is a building I work in. I used to have a studio here. It's just like this old rundown building. But I think so I've always been really interested in interior spaces. This is my grandma's basement. For a while there, I was making a lot of work about people's bedrooms because I thought in a way they served as a better portrait of a person than a picture of them could. And so I'm still thinking about that a lot. And part of me thinks that's remained in the back of my mind when I'm making interiors like this. Oops, this is a horse. She lives 2 houses down. Okay. And whenever I was coming home from my little walks, she would come over to the fence and I'd give her a little pat on the nose, and then we would both go on our merry way. So I made a little something to remember her. And this is just a gift for my brother. And then this chair, I put it here because this is around the time that I started working on it, but it took me a long time to finish it, and it just kind of stood in the corner on the wall, haunting me and taunting me for a couple of weeks before I figured out how to deal with it. So we'll put a pin in this and come back to it a little later. This is the trailer that is not on site, but maybe one day it will be. And if it is, you should definitely go. It is a really incredible space. And I made a lot of work about the trailer, and I don't think I'm done making work about the trailer. And in the spirit of James Castle, I think it's okay to let myself keep obsessing over this space over and over. He was so good at looking at a space he was familiar with and seeing it for the first time. There was always something new to see and to discover and to investigate. And so I'm definitely thinking about that a lot more than I had been before I came here. And something else that came up with the trailer is that in looking at this old wood with all of the peeling paint, it led me to really dive into this new thing that I hadn't done before, of layering many pieces of paper on top of each other and then scraping through with an X-Acto knife or tweezers to reveal what was underneath. So this one on the right was on its way to becoming the piece on the left. I was going to layer on top of it and scrape through, but I really liked the way it looked just on its own. And so I let it live and I started from scratch. And I really like them as a pair. I think it's interesting to think about like the building up of this thing and then its preservation and slow deterioration over time. And this is a goose, and this is some more geese, and this is a third goose, which were obviously really specifically influenced by James Castle. I think his geese constructions are some of my favorite pieces of his. They were also influenced just by the insane amount of geese that are in Boise. But in some ways, and you wouldn't be able to tell by looking at them, but for me, they're kind of about saying goodbye to a friend, and I'll tell you why. So these ones I made based off of photos I took after Robinson Moreno's final presentation over at Searle's place. So not the current resident, but the one just before her. Monica introduced us pretty early on, and we both didn't know anybody here, and we hung out quite a bit, and he really encouraged me to go swim in the river and go outside and see Boise. And I don't think I would have done any of that without his push. And so after his presentation, I walked over to Quinn's Pond and I sat there waiting for my Uber, which took a while to get to me. So I had some time to just take it all in, and the sun had set, so it was dark. And all of a sudden, all of these like 30 geese just kind of convened at the pond and started walking around and swimming and doing their little geese thing. It was almost like they had decided, okay, guys, like tonight we meet at 8:30. And so I took these really dark, blurry photos of them, and I came back here and I made these. And then that got me thinking about parking lot goose, which was a goose my mom and I stumbled upon at the grocery store. We went to go grocery shopping, we pull into the parking lot, and there's just this goose sitting in the middle of a parking space, in the middle of a busy parking lot. And so I was like, what is going on with this guy? And then we go and we do our grocery shopping. And then when we come out, he's still there. He hasn't moved at all. And so she's unloading things into the car, and I go check on him. And it seems to me like probably he's hurt. And I go back and I tell her, and she was like, well, he's going to be fox food or something like that. And then I said, please, can I please give him a piece of bread? Because we had just bought a kind of expensive loaf of bread from the bakery. And so she said no. And so I begged her, and eventually the thing that got her to give in, I said, do you really want him to die on an empty stomach? And so she said, fine. And so we fed him this bread and he loved it. And then we drove away and we never saw him again. And I still think about parking lot goose all the time. And my parents still buy that bread regularly and they call it goose bread to this day. So in some ways, these are weirdly about saying goodbye to a friend that I don't know if I'm ever going to see again. But of course, you would never know that just by looking at them if I didn't tell you those stories. So going back to the trailer, this is the kitchen. There's this precious little stove. It almost seems like a dollhouse stove. I don't know how else to explain it. And so I was thinking about how I felt again like I was getting a little bit too rigid. And so I'm always thinking about how I can go back to the first few collages I made when I was still really unfamiliar with the material. somehow that unfamiliarity brings like a surprise quality to the piece. And I haven't really been able to achieve that same quality since. I think I'm going to be chasing that forever. But I was really especially thinking about that in this one. And so I messed with the perspective a lot, like the door is kind of leaning over, and you shouldn't be able to see the top of that counter, but I put it there anyway. And I don't know if you would have been able to tell, but this kitchen collage is actually made with leftover color I had from this horse. And that's something that I have done a few times. If I had a bunch of leftover color that I thought was good, I'd save it in a pile based on what it was meant for, and then I would use it for something else later on. And then I made this, which is a little bit of a fluke. It's actually a sea bass, but it's definitely an outlier in the group. And I went out of town for a few days for my cousin's wedding, and I made this right before I left because I thought I have to make something really cool and good before I leave. And so this is what happened. And something really important just about my experience of being here is having the time and the space to play. I have so many obligations back home that I barely have time to get into the studio. And so every time I was able to steal a couple hours a week to go work on something, it felt like every single piece I made had to be incredible and important and meaningful. And that was definitely a little paralyzing for a while. But so I haven't really given myself permission in a long time before coming here to just experiment and play and make things for no reason other than I felt like it. And that's part of where this came from. And I do want to keep exploring this idea. It's not completely fleshed out yet, but what I'm thinking for now is you see all these pictures of guys holding up their fish like, look what I did, look what I got. And I thought about, well, what happens if you remove the identity and it's just these two hands, like, well, here's dinner. Like how I'm thinking about how I can change a trophy into an offering, but I have only made the one, and I want to make more and think about this idea more. So hopefully when I go home, I continue to do that. And then I made another shed piece, and I put a figure in it, which I don't usually do. I like to keep interiors especially free of figures, and especially in these spaces that I'm new to, because places like my grandma's cellar or my parents' house or my own room that I'm very familiar with, it feels like every piece of paper I put down could represent another feeling or memory I have associated with being there. But in spaces like James's shed or trailer, I can really only project assumption. And so I hesitate to do that. But something about looking into the trailer through this window or veil made me feel like I had permission to speculate about what might be inside. And so I decided to put a person in there, or the suggestion of a person in there. And this is another one that I used leftover color from. So I used leftover color from this and from the very first one that I made of the shed, just to make this study of that door from the outside. This is the trailer. This is the biggest work I've made here, and it took me a couple of weeks, and so I've spent a lot of time with it. And I really leaned into making it feel abandoned and empty, yet worn and lived in, because even though no one has lived there in years, when you walk in, you immediately sense a life lived in there. And so I was thinking about that. I also think, in a way, the materials themselves of the crayon's texture and the layered paper kind of lend themselves to that worn, lived-in quality. And a funky thing about this is that I messed around with these patches of pink and green light that don't actually make any sense in the space. But I put them there because I couldn't tell you why, I just decided to. And then in the end, I thought, okay, I'm gonna put, with the same exact pink and green, I'm gonna put these two crayons on this shelf. Almost like someone ran inside and drew all over the walls and then ditched their crayons and left it abandoned once again. Here's a flower. This is actually the stairs leading up to this space. So that little ladder and weird hole in the ceiling on the right is the same little ladder and weird hole in the ceiling on the left, or whatever. And so I'm thinking a lot about texture in this one. This felt like a turning point for me because I was thinking more about texture and pattern in terms of what the picture needed and less of, oh, well, that's how the space is, so that's how I'll make it. The bricks, for example, are there in that space. So I made them, and then there's this kind of lattice up on top. The stairs kind of fall into being a pattern. And then there's the wood planks on the floor, and then the whole right side was just flat color. And I said, well, this needs something. And so if this was a drawing or a painting, I probably would have put directional lines to kind of help inform structure and value. And so I thought, well, I can always chop up really thin pieces of paper and use them as line in the same way. And so this is one of the more recent ones that I made, and it feels like I'm on to something, and I'm excited about it. And then now we're back to the rocking chair. So this thing sat unresolved for almost a month, and it was really pissing me off because I thought, did I really make it? It's a kind of big, so it's gonna be a pain to ship back home. And I thought, did I really make this big thing that I'm gonna have to deal with? And it's just a boring picture of a chair. And then after making this one and playing around with texture and pattern, that definitely influenced me, and I leaned into it more. And so the rocking chair ended up becoming a collage entirely about pattern and texture. And I could say, like, oh, this is about my experience here and all the time I spent sitting in that chair eating breakfast or doing computer work, or all of the people before me that have come and spent time in this chair. But eventually it's when you get down to brass tacks, for me, this is really just about pattern and texture. And so I put in the wood grain and the fabric of the chair and the weird plywood floors that are in there. But then also I put in this wallpaper that was both in James Castle's shed and also the room that I live in right now. And this is not exactly what it looks like. There's 3 different types of sailboats within the wallpaper. And so I spent some time making a couple tiles of each one. And then I cut out tiles for the space in between because I really wanted to emphasize the idea of pattern in this. And I didn't want it to seem like just one plane of wallpaper. I wanted it to contrast a little bit more with these tiles against the wood grain. And honestly, Greg, I have to thank you, because when you asked me way back when, hey, have you sat in that chair? I think that really was the first little flame in my brain that made me even want to make a picture of it in the first place. So thank you, because this is the last thing I finished here, and it ended up being my favorite thing that I've made here, which is great because I am very sad to be leaving, but I am more excited about making art than I have ever been, I think. And so it's just really amazing to be able to leave on that high note. And obviously none of that would have ever happened if it weren't for the experience of being here. So thank you, and thanks to James Castle for making this happen. And I had one like little extra square that didn't make it into the piece, so now there's this very small little standalone square of wallpaper that I thought was sweet.
Thank you all for being here. Do we have some questions for Jenna? Yeah.
You mentioned like not wanting to do collage, that it's just like what you did before painting. What was your mindset around collage versus painting for it to kind of be like negative?
I don't really know. I think in the same ways that, and my ideas about this have also changed since, but in the same way that back then I thought oil paint was a million times better and more respectable than acrylic paint, collage was like another rung way below that. And I don't think about it that way now. I think I was just young and naive and didn't really know anything about art or art history.
You can't see the light.
It's so exciting that James Castle obviously spoke to you long before you came here. You know, you come here because looking at your work before you said you'd seen him. Of course, all of us are going, "Holy, I get it, right?" But now that you have been here, how do you think it's changing your go forward now that you've really been immersed in?
Let's repeat the question.
Okay.
So now,
Yeah.
now that you've spent time here at the Castle House, going forward, how do you see your experience here help you move forward?
I guess. Well, I think I'm a person that gets really obsessed with things really easily. And I was hesitant before coming here to make the same picture of the same thing over and over. But since, I mean, you can see there's a lot of repetition in image here, but I went to the archives and it is in however much repetition you thought there was, there's so much more. There's so much more. And so that was really validating in a way. I thought, you know, it's okay to investigate the same thing over and over and to reference previous works and new works. And I think one of the biggest gifts I've had from coming here is just the gift of obsession. And so I'm definitely going to be thinking about that going forward.
I was curious, were you a creative child, or when did you start getting into art?
So when did you start getting into art? Were you a creative child?
I'll say yes. Yes. The answer is yes. I hesitate to say yes so quickly because I do know people that I met in school who were so much more dedicated to art and having a practice at like 11. I definitely didn't have that. I liked making art as a kid, and so I made art as a kid. And everybody around me was like, "So you're gonna go to art school, right?" And I said, "No." And I don't know, some teacher eventually was like, "You're gonna go to art school." And I said, "Okay." But I didn't really take it seriously. But the answer is yes, I always have had that creative itch.
We have a question over here. It says, what was your impression of Idaho and Boise before your residency, and has it changed in any way?
Yeah, I didn't really have an impression of Idaho at all before coming here. I thought I would be in a much more empty space. I didn't realize how, and I could have looked it up really easily and seen, but my impression of Boise was James Castle's drawings, and I really thought that I was going to come here and it was going to look just like that. And that, and that nothing has been developed for decades. And that it was just going to be me and the horses and the geese and the potatoes. And instead, I came here and I met this beautiful community of artists and people. And if my family wasn't hours and hours away, I would definitely be pulled to spend a lot more time here.
Any other questions? Okay, I don't see any others online either. Well, we're going to open up the studio space, and I want to thank everybody here, and I want to thank everybody online as well for joining us. Thank you, Lavona, for interpreting tonight. It's always wonderful to work with you. Have a great evening. If you haven't been to the James Castle House, please come. There is a lot of stuff happening all the time. If you're not part of our newsletter, join our newsletter. That's a really good way to get information, and our Instagram page is also another good way. Thank you all. Have a good night, and we can come into the space.